Hey everybody, hi. Welcome to another episode of Curated Reality. Today's we last week we took a break over the holidays so that everybody could relax. We got back this week, kicking off this new year with a very special guest, somebody who has been I've been meeting like randomly at different conferences. Like last year, I think of the nine conferences I spoke at, I met Joe at eight of them probably, and yeah, it was very, very nice to keep running into him at each conference, and it was fun that way. Hey, Joe, welcome to the channel. Thank you for making time for us today.
No problem. Thank you for having me. It's great to chat about everything we're going to talk about today. And yeah, I miss bumping into you. Hopefully this year, 2021, will be later in the year we can start doing some of that again.
Yeah,
Mhm.
and yeah, as always, we have Vedant with
Hello.
us as well.
Yep.
Cool. So let's start off like one of the just as a casual starting entry point, right? You have been working with like server driven UI for a while. You have had a couple of blog posts now around it and things like that, right? What was your motivation to get started? Like, why even consider server driven UI, right? Like, and why now? Why not in the past, right? What changed in that sense that you even started to consider it?
Yeah, that's a great starting point. So, a big motivation for trying new things like this for me personally, like outside of whether it's server driven UI or not, is just to do stuff that I don't usually do in my day to day. Like I don't do the stuff I don't do at work. I think is good to bring into side projects and experiment with things and be like, is this something that could help me or is this something I could use? That's how I get a lot of ideas for the things I build. Is just in my own time, just playing around with bits. And this was a perfect example of that. It's one of those things where I was like, is this going to be a pain to work with, or is this going to work in my favor? Um, and with Compose Academy, which is a website for Jetpack Compose snippets, um, I wanted to build a I wanted to rebuild the website because I was using GitHub Pages, and GitHub Pages is great, but I was hitting a lot of snags into like being able to customize things and really have some functionality that I really wanted on the site. And then I had plans to build, which I haven't finished yet, a Mac app, and then also like an Android app so that people could use it on like Chromebooks and so on. And then I was like, well, that's a lot of work. Like I'm gonna have to build like native. I'll have to build a React app. Gonna have to build a Mac app and then an Android app as well. And that's a lot of work for one person. And I've already got life. And 2020 was plenty of other things going on. So I started to think about ways which maybe I could make that like reduce some of the friction there, and maybe if there was a way that I could shift some of that responsibility onto the server and have the clients, still render the UI, but not have all that duplicated logic and logic around how that UI is rendered. Um, and I so what was that? When was this? At work, slightly going off on the tangent a bit, but I started having some calls with developers who were using GraphQL, um, and there was is it Maria? I think it was Maria. It was Maria. I talked to her, I can put this in the notes in the chats. There's someone called Maria in the Android community, and I talked to her about GraphQL, and she was telling me about how at Deliveroo they have some screens which are rendered, like the server sends back how that screen should be handled in terms of its presentation.
Right.
And so I was thinking, oh, could do something like that for the whole app, for the whole of Compose Academy. I could take that idea I think they're just using it on like one screen, so it could be a bit dynamic. And I thought, oh, I could try and do that for the whole app. And so I thought, that sounds like a great thing to do, and that would really help me to achieve what I'm trying to achieve. So that's kind of where it came from, and that's kind of why I decided to do it. Why didn't I do it sooner? I didn't have that seed planted by someone else. Like if it wasn't mentioned, then I'm not sure I would have thought of that straight away. And second of all, I think with the rise of decorative UI frameworks, like it's definitely less friction in doing this. Totally possible with like the current Android UI toolkit, but I just think having the decorative UI makes it a lot a lot simpler to do so. So yeah, you could do it with how things are at the moment, but I think, yeah, like I said, definitely a lot easier to do it with the new UI frameworks that are coming in place.
Right. Right. So, uh, as you mentioned, right, like Compose Academy was like majorly why you started looking at it. Give and as you mentioned that you would have to go down the native Mac app and like a website for a React or Vue kind of a website layer as well, right? And yeah, that is like a great motivation to get started off, right? Uh, do you how would you rate, like I know it is still very early for Compose in its on its own as a framework or
Mm.
this, but then uh, how do you think it would scale? Do you think the motivation that you started off with, right, using server driven with Compose, do you think that would scale? Did you have any challenges right away? And I know while this all of it what you face today might change tomorrow as we know it today, right? But then just to get a sense of where we are at and what that piece looks like as well.
Mm. Yeah, no, that's a good point. Like, there are definitely some challenges that I've run into and some things that I wish I had done differently from the start. Like the Android and the iOS apps aren't finished, or the Mac app, but the website, the Composer Academy website that's currently launched, is using the server driven UI. And there's, I'd say, like, for it probably works better for larger projects and for projects with more going on. Like, if you were building like a single screen app, like, I don't know if it would make sense, because the whole way it works is, I think when I've talked to people about it, like, there's a lot of thoughts that there's a lot of magic going on, a lot of, like,
Right.
maybe the server sending back like the actual compose functions. Like, it's nothing like that. The way it works is that each client will have, like, well, there's what's it called? I've forgotten the word. A design system. That's the word I was looking for. A design system, and each of those apps will implement that design system, and have like their own library of native components that match that design system. The server will send back the presentation for a screen, and then that presentation will be mapped to each of those native components, and the screen will be rendered based off that. So if you've got a design system, and if you've got like multiple screens that are using the same components, then I think this is where I'm starting to notice where this is really shining. Like, when I did the first version of Compose Academy, like the first release a few months ago, there was only a couple of screens, and I was like, yeah, this is actually a little bit of a pain, like, to be honest, in some parts. But now I started adding more. As I started adding more pages, like, I added, I shipped, I made some changes to the article screen, and I shipped a new blog post feature the other day, and also a search feature last month. And as I was adding more features, I was like, wow, these features are actually not taking me long to add, because everything's already defined and I'm just reusing what's there. And a lot of the work was being used on the server. And now I'm implementing the search on the Android app, and it's the same thing. It's like, oh, just, I've already implemented this stuff on the API, and it's just chucking me back what you tell it to tell the client what needs to be rendered. And there are a few snags I've been running into. Like, one of the things I was trying to do on the Android app when I was like experimenting with this was trying to render like the whole screen, like the toolbar and everything, and coming back from the server, um, which was a bit of a pain, because then you're trying to lay out everything on the whole screen. But what I'm doing in the web app is just rendering the content area. So, like, the
Right.
toolbar and the search bar is already predefined, and that way the app is handling the navigation, but all it's doing is the content area is just rendered by the server. And I think that makes more sense, because then you leave all, like, the navigational aspect and everything else down to the actual client, and then the server just tells the client what to be shown within that content area. Um, that's definitely one of the things that I wish I did from the start, because I did it the other way with the website originally, and it was a bit of a pain. Um, so yeah, and the other thing is, like, with the design system, like, there's been a few things where I needed to do specific things for specific components that weren't in the design system, and that's when it's a bit of a pain, because it's like the server's chucking you back this thing, but you need it to be slightly different here. But then
Right.
you're like, do I add this, like, if if statement, or do I have to do this conditional thing, or and that's where I'm starting to notice where it is a bit of a pain. So definitely in cases where you've got like a design system and you're sticking strictly to that, definitely that's a strength there, but otherwise, it can be a bit cumbersome.
So basically, the server communicates to the client with some kind of contracts like JSON, and you render the UI on the front end according to that JSON, right?
Hmm. Yes, yeah.
For example, suppose I want to build a website which looks different in desktop and different in phone. How do you define those logics? Where do you define those logics mainly?
So I'm not too savvy on the web front,
Yeah.
but if you're doing stuff with like, is it like CSS and like media queries, that would all be done on the client. Like if you're doing that kind of thing, if you were rendering specific components, like say if you were on a desktop, you were showing a card,
Right.
but if you're on mobile, you're showing a text view, for example, then that would need to come back from the API depending on the client that's making the request. So if you were on the web and you wanted to do conditional rendering, you would need to send something to the server. You'd have to make a change there to do that. That's not something that I've had to do, but that could be one of the cases where it's like, well, could that be a bit of a pain? Like, should the server know about that? I wouldn't see a problem with it, but I think that's one of the things you could do. Yeah.
Right. And I think one of the advantages of using GraphQL is that, right? Like based on the client, you could request whatever data you need, and you could pass in a different parameter and get a different UI hierarchy itself, right? Like as you mentioned, if you want to show a text view on mobile but show it like a title bar on the web, then the API could just return you those directly instead of having that logic. But yeah, to some extent, one of the challenges with GraphQL has been that, right? That does it belong to server or does it belong to the client? That bifurcation and separation starts to fade away, right? Because a lot of the logic gets crumbled up in the sense that, hey, you know what, should the client be sending this or should the server know about what the rendering needs to be done, is what we tend to do, right? Do
Yeah. There is one thing that I've done with what was it? Just so when you're rendering, because the website supports dark and light mode, and each article screen has like code snippets, and there is something I had to do where I have to send the theme that's being used in the query, like in the GraphQL query, like if it's dark theme or light theme, just so that the code snippet URL we get back is in the right theme.
right.
There's probably a better way I could handle that, but that was just like, 'cause I wanted to ship. I told myself I was going to ship this by a certain date, so I was like, I'm just going to do this for now, and then I can tidy this up later. That's kind of along the lines, I guess, of sending something to a server and getting a specific thing back for the condition.
Okay, so there's a question in our chat. Adit is asking composable views. It is so much like epoxy. Have you had chance to work with epoxy? And is there any tips on interrupt migrating screens to be doable?
That's a good question, but not something I could really. I haven't actually used epoxy. It's a buy and Airbnb, isn't it?
Right.
I can get it up quickly and have a quick peek because I know it's open source. I know I've seen a few people talking about similar stuff in the community about using Compose/epoxy. Yeah, I wouldn't be able to answer that, I'm afraid, like without really diving into it too much. But it looks, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I can see the point. It's very similar. I don't know in terms of like, I guess the people to be. I'm sure. I don't know for sure, but maybe this support for epoxy will still continue, like regardless of Jetpack Compose. Like there's probably reasons why Airbnb are using that, and then maybe there's some stuff under the hood that's works well for their apps. But maybe that's down to, if you're using epoxy in a project, maybe that's down to your business to decide, should we continue using that or should we focus more on using the official supported solution, depending on what works best for the product, I guess.
Have you made any open source example where we can maybe take a look? how you have implemented, or if you can show us, then it will be also fine.
Yeah, I can show you. None of the Academy stuff's open source yet, but I happily to share my screen and run through some stuff, how things are working. Yeah, so where do I start? I'll start at the API, just so we can see how things are sort of working from the ground up. Feel free to stop me and ask questions at any point if you spot anything that might be interesting to dive more into. So with GraphQL, you have a schema, and the schema kind of defines everything that is supported by the API, everything that can be queried, every piece of data model that exists in your API, and also along with the operations that clients can perform. Like, so in the case of Compose Academy, we only support queries. So you could retrieve the categories of subjects and topics. And each of those is, let's have a look. So these are the categories, and we jump into subject, and then these are all the topics,
Right.
and then we have an article. So in the case of this, yeah, you can query each of those screens, and then when those queries are performed, each of those queries returns a presentation. And a presentation is just a collection of abstract components, and each of those components represents a different child, which is a child in our design system. So the nice thing about GraphQL is everything is strongly typed. So everything the client gets back is a type. It's not like a string or like some valuable value that could be incorrectly interpreted.
Mm-hmm.
It's a strongly typed object. So when the client gets back an image or a code snippet, it knows exactly what it is. And that's one of the reasons why I chose to use GraphQL alongside it being quite nice to work with. So in the GraphQL, we have all the different components that are supported. So let's take a look at, so the detail card, that's the thing we saw on the home screen. So we have a title, a description, along with an action. And this is exactly what's displayed here, title, description.
Mm-hmm.
And then have other things like we have the toolbar. I don't think that's actually being used anymore. That's what I mentioned previously. I'm no longer doing the toolbar rendering from the API. So essentially everything you see on screen within that content area is defined as a type on the API. When it comes to retrieving that, so when I perform this, say, categories query, and I get back this presentation object with this list of children, that is handled by what's called a resolver. So if we go on categories, for example, what happens here is that query for categories, this resolver gets hit here. This enters this block of code, retrieve the list of categories from the database, which are all of these, and then we return the collection of children that are to be displayed by the client. So there's a lot going on here, so we'll just run through a couple of bits. So what happens with this is you may notice there are some of these types defined here. So with GraphQL, I know I mentioned we don't have strings on the client side. We have the types that are returned. Within resolvers, we can't do, like, for example, we can't say this is of the type banner. We have to return a string here.
Mm-hmm.
So what happens here is when this resolver is returned, this actually gets mapped to the type that's in our schema. So this is the banner here, and this is done using enums. So this is these are all defined up here. Each of these enums.
Oh.
So this will get automatic. Yeah. So this banner will automatically get mapped using this enum to this banner type. I won't go into the internals of how that works, but that's what's happening there. Just using enums to do that. So when this child is returned to the client after when a query is performed, the client will get back that banner type with the corresponding data populated, which is this here. So we have the text and the link, and so this is the text that's displayed here inside of this banner, and then when you click the link, that's the URL that it goes to. And that's the same for each of the other components inside of that resolver. So we have that vertical scroller, which is actually that grid that's displayed there. If you make the screen smaller, it works on mobile to just do a single column, which is nice. But that's exactly the same. So we have the type, which will map to vertical scroller in our schema. And then for each of the categories that are returned from the database query, we populate each of those. Sorry, not populate. We create another type from our schema, which is the detail card, and we populate that detail card using that data from the database. Yeah, everything else works the same. We have each of the types and each of the children are returned. So that as a whole makes up an array of children displayed in order of how they should be displayed on the screen. Yeah, the toolbar's still being returned there, but I don't think that's actually being used. Yeah, it's not. So yeah, each of those children returned. So yeah, and then the client will receive back those things and render them. Any questions on the API side so far? Or anything you want to dive into a bit more?
No, I think. Anand, do you have any question?
Yeah, should be
Yeah.
fine.
Cool. So with that in place, yeah, the API is essentially saying this is what the screen should look like. You should have a banner, you should have a toolbar, then you should have the scroller with a collection of detail cards, and then you should also render this metadata. And this is just used for like the social sharing stuff. So this was something that this is one of those situations that I had to do. Had to tweak, which I wasn't too sure about doing. Basically, like when you share a link to Twitter, it generates a Twitter card, and because these screens are dynamic and every screen is different, the API needs to return back that metadata, so that the screen can render it when the link preview is generated. So this is being returned on each of these screens. So a better example of this is in the article screen, because the metadata is dependent on the article and the article title, which needs to be at the root level of the website. So this has to be returned by the API as part of the dynamic content, which is one of those things that's like, well, that's not UI. It didn't feel right, but it was also one of those things where I just wanted to get it working. So yeah, again, yeah, like I said, that's not part of the design system, but it needs to be done by the API. So that's one of the things where this is a bit not too sure on that. But yeah, so that's it on the kind of API side. When it comes to the web, we'll use the web app just because it's the thing that's published. A lot of this is still like work in progress and things pieced together. So apologies if there's any bad stuff anywhere. But as an example of, we'll do the categories screen, for example. So in GraphQL, essentially, Adnan mentioned before about how you can, in GraphQL, you can query what you want. So if you're querying on mobile, if you're querying on web, you can kind of have control over what you're querying for. And that's one of the really nice things of GraphQL here, because we can query our categories and children, but we don't, if I'm on mobile, I might want to show this banner. So I don't need to query that banner, and the API won't return me it. So the client still has control over what it gets back. The API is just not always going to return everything, so we can still customize it on a client level, which is cool. So when it comes to the display of the categories, again, we use the banner as an example. We are using these things called fragments in GraphQL, which are essentially like reusable query components. So all this is yeah, so on our API, we define this type of banner, which has a text, link, and a type. All we're doing here is saying, I want to query a banner, and I want to get this data back from it. I want the text, the link, and the type. If we didn't want the type or the link, for example, we could just say, I just want the text. We have complete control over that. So when that query is executed, we're going to get back that banner as a strongly typed component, and we can use it in our project. And the same thing for the vertical scroller. Again, that's using fragments. We query the content of the vertical scroller, and then we do the same thing with the detail card. We get the title, the description, and so on. So these are I'm using these things called fragments here because, as I mentioned previously, we have the categories, the subjects, and the topics, and all those screens are pretty much the same. They have the cards, and you click through the cards to go to the next screen. So these reusable fragments allow us to just reuse that in multiple places. So, for example, you can see here the vertical scroller is used across numerous different queries.
Right.
So we can query for the category screen, and that gives us back the presentation that we need. Yeah. So then what happens when we get that data back? Let's take example. This is the categories React component. That might be the right terminology. I think so. So all this does is this is just executes the GraphQL query using the query that we just looked at. I can't remember what that's called, get article. I need to rename that. So it will execute that query, and it will get back the result from the query, which will be the JSON that the API was showing.
Yep.
Is all of this. That will be mapped to TypeScript components, TypeScript types. So we have a strongly typed component set of each of those components. And then what we do is when we have that data, as you can see, there's not really much going on in this component. We get the data and we just handle it. And it's the same for a lot of the screens. So when we have that data, we pass all of those types to what we call a component factory. And each of the clients has one of these. And this is basically like a collection of functions which takes the TypeScript type and renders the component based on that. So for example, in the case of the banner, where we pass the, where is it? So yeah, so the first thing is all essentially happening here is we get the list components back from the API, and then we basically use the TypeScript types to then decide which function should be called and which component should be rendered. So it's basically just like a switch statement, like, or an if statement that basically loops through each of those types and then renders a component based on that type. Nothing magical going on here. Just nothing fancy. It's just a little bit of essentially looping through the components. So for example's sake, when we get to the banner, so if there's a type of banner in the component list from the API, we push what is returned from this function to our list of components to be displayed on screen. So this banner will take the TypeScript type banner. It will render the component based on that, which is, in our case, essentially a full width button. It will take that button, give it a label, and also handle the link clicking. So when that link is clicked, it will take you to that Android tutorial that we just saw. And that's the same for each of these things. It's just a collection of functions which take their type and render the data for it. So same thing for the detail card. It's just a reusable card that takes the title, the description, and uses any of the data to handle the link clicks also. So yeah, like I said, nothing magical going on there. It's just looping through each of the types and then generating the components based on that. So once that's done, a list of React nodes are returned, and the category screen will essentially display that list of items on screen, and that gives us what we see here. And each of these screens are very similar. We're just reusing each of the things that are there. I think in terms of the website, I think that's kind of a high level of what's going on there. I don't think there's anything I missed, but happy to answer any questions on that so far, if anything comes to mind.
Adit again asked, how do we manage versions on the API side of the same view in different mutation?
Yeah, so I haven't got to the point of needing to do API versioning yet, but with GraphQL, as far as I understand, it's really good built-in support for that. So you can either, well, you can change the API version and leave kind of V1 in support, so things will still be working. And you can also deprecate API, like whether it's models, types, queries, using specific annotations, so the clients will know if that's deprecated. In my case, I'll probably just do the versioning. So I'm currently working on some stuff for Compose Academy, which would be like, for example, user login and also changing the design to the screens a bit. And for that, I probably will change the version of the API because there's going to be quite a few changes. But obviously, I still want the older clients, for example, like I plan on launching the Android and Mac app soonish, so they'll still need to be supported and they'll be using V1 of the API. So for that, I'll be versioning the API to ensure that the old components of the design system and the old ways of working will still be functioning as expected, or at least that's the plan.
Right. Right. The just to add to that, right? Uh, Ideally, you should most of the use cases where a versioning comes into picture for REST APIs is where you have breaking changes right to the data structure and that same API being consumed by multiple clients. And that is where the whole beauty of GraphQL comes into picture, right? You only query what you need as a client, right? So unless like a data type change happened, right? Like something which was a string converted to a long or an int, you should ideally never had the need to do versioning. But then if you ever need to, then it is very similar to what REST is today, right? You could just create a v2 of the same thing and still do it, but then it kind of starts to defeat the whole purpose of using GraphQL to begin with in the first place, right? Like you would rather be smart about it and only use things from the client that the client actually renders. And then that way, if you launch a new feature on the web which requires a couple of new changes that happen, then only the web needs to change and everybody else can continue doing the same thing.
Yeah, totally, that makes sense. Yeah, like I said, I haven't used versioning there yet for GraphQL, so that's quite helpful to know. Yeah, I can hop over to I can show you some stuff on the Android side of things if that helps, because I think that's a bit more specific to what people might be after. Yeah, so again, this is still very work in progress. But on when it comes to the Compose side of things, it's very similar. And you could start to say like, oh well, each of these clients are mapping stuff, like that's still a lot of duplication. But one of the things, each of the clients like native, and I wanted each client to have control over their UI in terms of how they would display that UI. Like the server gives them back like how things should be laid out and what should be displayed, but I wanted each of the clients to be able to actually be responsible for those components. There are ways of is it John? I think it's John Sundell. Swift, is it Swift by Sundell? I think it is. He did some stuff where he was actually returning. I think he was returning like Swift UI functions from the API and having them like generated on the fly. That is possible with Swift UI. I haven't tried that with Compose, and a few people told me it might be possible. A few people said it wasn't possible. Which it could be nice to have the API actually generate those composable functions, but then at the same time, like that could get very complex. And like, what happens with navigation? What happens with animations and like really like native specific things? And I think that could get a bit messy. So I decided to stick with the route of having the client actually just control, how those components are rendered and how they're shown on screen. So yeah, so the Compose side of things when it comes to Android is very similar. Like we get the strongly typed components back this time Kotlin, and this is made really nice because of Apollo Android, which is an open source Android library for GraphQL communication from Android clients. And so I'm using that, and that would essentially have my queries, and when those queries are executed, they return the strongly typed components back. So where are we? So in the case of the categories, have exactly very similar thing as to what I have on web. We have the categories, we query the categories, we query its children, and we control exactly what we get back. So in this case of Android, I'm not showing the banner, we're just having the toolbar and the vertical scroller. So again, using fragments, which is nice there. And one of the cool things here is I'm actually using Kotlin multi-platform. Apollo have a multi-platform library. So for the Mac app and the iOS app and Android app, all sharing the same queries, the same networking logic, which is very nice. So I haven't looked at this code in a while. So so it's very similar thing here. We are the categories. Yeah, so we take our query the categories, and then when we get the components back, we map those components to the composables that are going to be displayed on screen. So when we get that response back, like I said, you do the same thing as web, take that type and we map it. So in the case of this, when we have a title text component from the API and the GraphQL response, we create a new composable using the title text composable function, and that just returns a text composable. And the same thing for other things, like we saw the detail card on web as well. That's the same thing here, a card composable with the children inside of that, which, to render that on screen. And it's pretty much the same for everything else, just composable functions returning based on the function that's called. So it's very similar to each of the clients. They just have control over their native components. And then, as I said, same for iOS, Swift UI, similar thing, switching through the component type that returned, which in this case, again, this is using the Kotlin multi-platform for Apollo. And then not so much work done here yet on the iOS side, but we had the vertical scroller and we had the detail card, and we generate the Swift UI component based on that detail card that is returned to it. So it's rendering a response. And I built the website first, but building the mobile apps has been I was gonna say they haven't taken me that long. Haven't actually spent that much time on them. Even though I started them about a couple months ago, but haven't spent much time. But the time I have spent hasn't been that much, and it hasn't taken long to get the screens together and start seeing results once these factories are built. It's been really, really frictionless to sort of start piecing screens together.
Right. I think the Kotlin multi-platform thing is really a very cool idea there, right? Like the whole idea that you could execute all your business logic irrespective of it, and then using natively to render the UI finally. Like it is in a way dynamic at every layer that is possible, up until the last layer wherein it is actually responsible for rendering the UI, right? Because right from the API response itself is based on the client request. GraphQL gives you a dynamic response and not the static response every time you pass the same parameters. But then it also is with Kotlin multi-platform, you didn't have to do the whole networking layer and the logic of parsing and things like that back in like each iOS, Android, and web separately, right? So it was just one.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so the workload's even reduced even more just because of the use of Kotlin multi-platform, which I haven't hit any snags yet. I think it's getting, when I first tried Kotlin multi-platform like early last year, whenever it was, quite a while ago, it was a bit of a pain to get started with and a bit of a pain to use. But this time around, it felt a lot smoother to get things in place, which is nice. And especially with like all the queries and stuff, and like working with GraphQL, like being able to just reuse all this is really nice. And with on web, so on web, the TypeScript model generation is automatic. Whenever I have a schema change, like I have my models generated automatically. But with mobile side of things, you don't have that. So I are having to map like each of the I'm still diving into the Apollo SDKs, so I'm trying to find out if there's a way to not use these strings. Because
Right.
so this logic is with multi-platform. This logic is only being done once. This kind of stuff like mapping these responses from the GraphQL to strongly typed components. So we have things here like we map component, and we map if it's a vertical scroller, we map it to this vertical scroller class, Kotlin class, and that does the same for each of the models. But because you're using multi-platform, you do that once in one place, and iOS and Android can share that, which is really nice.
Okay, so there's another question in chat. This is kind of a general one. Is Jetpack a good framework for server-driven UI in Android?
Sorry, is what?
Is Jetpack Compose a good framework for server-driven UI in Android?
If you are looking to do server-driven UI, like I think Jetpack Compose is a nice thing to use. Like with the you could, like I said previously, you could do this with the UI toolkit. So, for example, if you're not using composable functions, you could have. I think what you could do, you could have this return like a list of views, for example. This isn't going to compile, but just a pseudocode, you could have this function return a list of views, and then each of these functions could return a view, and then you could do like, I don't know, return text view. Doing so much compose and forgetting how to write normal Android. You could do stuff like this, and then you'd have to have like context, and you could like you apply stuff and make changes. It would be a lot more work and probably a lot more like boilerplate and a lot more code. It's certainly possible. Like you don't have to use this with Jetpack Compose. I just think Jetpack Compose makes it a lot nicer and a lot easier to do so. Same with like Swift UI. Like it would still be possible to do this without Swift UI and just to use UI Toolkit, but I imagine it would be a lot more of a pain to do so. So yeah, I think as well, if you do want to go down the route of having things, whether it's possible or not, having these composable functions generated on the server, like that is something that is probably likely to be more possible with Jetpack Compose rather than Android how it currently is. The same with Swift UI, like what I was saying that John Sundell's achieved. I don't think that would be possible with UI with the I can't remember what it's called, UI toolkit on iOS. I don't think that would be possible with that, but it is possible with Swift UI. So yeah, it's in a nutshell. Going back to the original question, Compose, yeah, it's a great framework for doing it, but it's not restricted to it. And an important thing I want to add to that is like server. I've enjoyed working with server-driven UI with this, but it's not for everything. So I want to make that clear. Like I don't think I'm not going to use this on every project that I build in my spare time, because I've built the API. I've had a lot of control over how things work. But I'm not. Yeah, if it's like a simpler project or maybe a project that I might, for whatever reason, I might decide it's not a good fit. I won't be using this for everything moving forward. I think for this use case, it's worked well, and I think that's important to evaluate before you think about using it, or try adopting it in projects at work or so on. Just wanted to point that out. Yeah.
Right. There have been a couple of unofficial ports, right? Like Jetpack Compose for the web and like iOS as well, which uses composable functions and renders native UI, right? Do you think if they ever support it in the future, do you think that changes your the way you envision this? Right now, it gives you the freedom that the rendering is up to the native client, right? Like I be it web, Android or iOS. But let's say tomorrow if Jetpack Compose supports web and Android and iOS using the same set of composable functions, right? Do you think that would change any of the pieces in you? Like, do you think that would be a good direction to move to, or what are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, that's a good one. If in terms of like, do you mean like in terms of like the server rendering it, or just in reusing composables in general?
Both ways. Like there is,
Mm.
as you mentioned, right? There are two aspects to it. One is just reusing it on the front end, and the second is basically if you could send this entire function, composable function itself from the server as well. That is
Mm.
the second feature of it, right?
Yeah.
Because yeah, what are your thoughts on both of them that way?
Yeah, I think so. In terms of like having the server return them, I think like I think it will have its if it was possible. I think it would have its place. Um, I would like again without seeing what it might look like. I think for like maybe simpler screens, like maybe if you've got a screen that's like quite static and is just showing some information and I don't know, like a detail screen, for example, that probably is a good use case. I think when there could be complications if things like animations, navigation, like native specific things, like I don't know how that would work. Probably hack something together to get it to work, but I think it's about finding that balance of responsibilities. Like, what should the server be responsible for, and what should the client be responsible for? Like, for example, even with the navigation component, like there's navigation component explorations and actually support for Compose that's in alpha, I think. And it's trying to think like how would that work if the server was controlling the composable functions? Like how do we handle navigation? Would the server return would the server just return everything? Could do. I'm sure there'd be some snags that we'd run into. And the same thing for animations. I know like not a lot of apps are heavily into animations, but Compose does ease that process a bit. And then it's like, well, what if we need to do like shared element transitions? Like we're going from one screen to another, like handing on that on web could be like in a server response could get a bit complicating, a bit messy. Just things like that, which would make me question like, should we do this? And like I said, it probably would have its places for some screens, and especially for reusability. Like if like what I've done here is like you could like well I've even thought this is like well so I've got to build each of these native design systems like done it 3 times, built the same component on three different clients. It's not a lot of code, but it's if I decide to change one thing, I've got to change it in all 3 places. So it would be nice to think how could I achieve consistency and also not have to make that many changes, and that would be a good solution for that is to have the composables or whatever returned from the server. And there are I remember I saw something on Twitter yesterday about ports for Compose on web, and I think there's Compose desktop is actually has like official support from JetBrains.
Yeah.
So for certain clients you could have composables return. Like you could do like we said before about the conditional rendering. Like you could say for desktop and Android clients return composable functions, whereas for iOS clients return the presentation or so on. That could be a way to go around that at the same time without overcomplicating it, because trying to handle too much with one way could result in a lot of mess at the same time. Did that answer both questions?
Yeah, it does. It does.
Yeah.
Like I think I feel similar to it, right? Like one of the biggest thing I think sending the entire composable function from the server would result in things like the whole idea of being able to do that is to achieve dynamic UI, right? And it starts to break apart wherein what happens to actions and click listeners and things like that, right? Like focus events, and because there is no way you can define those dynamically, right? Like let's say today, yes, you could send the UI, the entire composable function, the UI could be rendered definitely, but then there is no way you could tell the button that there is a new API that you need to call, right? Unless like you build your system in a way wherein everything just passes a key back and then you somehow try to map it on your server and then like try to coordinate and orchestrate all of those things, right? And that's where I think the argument fails for me, because there is never going to be a use case that I would think that you like ever in a production application that would require such kind of coordination and things, right? If you are going to that extent, might as well just write it manual natively every time that you care about it, right?
Yeah.
It's great when there is a fixed interaction, right? Like if you're opening a web page always based on the link that you have been sent, that's an
Mm,
easy one to do, right? Like, hey, you could render any UI you want. Clicking on it just has a link component which opens a web view somewhere in the app itself. So that
mm,
scales. Like you could do especially like promotions around the festival time, sales, offers, and things like that. These work great. You could customize the UI without an app update and things like
mm,
that, right? Because that's the biggest bottleneck that we have today as an app developer. So I think that's great for such use cases. But then like a full-fledged app which is nothing on the client at all and everything server rendered with the even the functions coming from the server, I think that's like a fetching like for too far reached at this point at
mm.
least.
Yeah, I think that's one of those situations where you're at first it might work well, and then you're run into something, and you'll be like, oh well, how do we do this? And then it'll be one of those shoot yourself in your foot situations. And I think like even with server driven UI, I think Compose Academy works well because it's quite structured and it's quite simple. Like have a list of cards, three of the screens are the same, and then you have an article screen, and the blog post screen is just like a vertical list of content. It's you know it's quite strictly structured. So I think the server driven UI works well for that. On the other hand, if you had complex layouts and things that were like I know trying to think like a constraint layout, for example, like
Right.
that kind of layout, like where things are like based off of other positions or aligned to certain areas. That's the point where I start to think you might run into struggles where server-driven UI maybe isn't the best thing to do for that screen. Might end up being more hassle than it's worth. For example, like I know Airbnb do. I don't know if they still do, but a couple of years ago they were doing server-driven UI for their listing screens, which is just essentially a vertical list of content with some horizontal rows in it. But it's the same kind of thing as the article screens that I've got. Like it's just a list of a list of components, and they're displayed in vertical manner. And I think for those it works well. But yeah, as soon as you start to hit more complex layouts, that's when you probably run into problems as well.
Right.
Mm. But yeah,
Apart,
oh sorry.
go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just saying, like, if people were exploring like the fully server-driven UI with like returning composable functions, I'd love to hear about it or read about it. Like, not going to knock it until I've seen it in action.
Right. So, while having to deal with the entire thing, right? What would, according to you, was the most hardest in the entire thing of building the Compose Academy using GraphQL and Jetpack Compose on Android and things like that, right? What do you think was the most challenging in that sense, and what do you think needs more maturity going forward, at least?
Yeah, great question. I think the challenging thing was mainly like I think it was for me it was the responsibilities thing, like especially when it comes to the web, is like knowing what the server should do when it comes to the UI and knowing like yeah how much it should return and how much the actual client should be responsible for doing. Because I think when I first started it, like I was trying to have the server do everything and have the server return the complete presentation, and that's why like I was previously doing the toolbar and the search bar, and I was hitting some snags and in laying things out, and then thinking, oh, how will this look on mobile? How will this look on web? And just trying to do too much. Um, that was the point when I stepped away and I said, okay, we're just going to render the content area from the server. Yeah, and that things got a lot easier that way. Um, and I purposely tried to do everything on the server because I wanted to see what was possible, and I think it's not like I regret doing it that way to begin with. It's just it got a bit challenging. Um, I'm very when I hit a problem, I'm very like focused and I want to solve it. So I wasted a lot of time like trying to get it to work. When really I should have just stepped back and been like, okay, this is overcomplicated for what it needs to be. Like the whole point of this approach is to keep things simple and to make my life easier. And what I'm doing isn't isn't achieving that. So yeah, I think it was definitely the most challenging thing was setting those boundaries and realizing the responsibilities of the client and then also of the server. And then also just like building a GraphQL API. Like I've worked on APIs before and I've built some simple APIs, but nothing on this level that's, you know, especially with the server driven UI stuff, like working out the best way for that to work, like doing the database queries and trying to optimize that as a whole was a good experience, and a few challenges here and there. I think there was a second part to that question, but I can't remember it.
Cool. There was one other question in the live chat. Who has okay? So I think Deepak is speaking about Vue.java. So Vue has thousands of lines of code. So can it replace the Vue class entirely without updating in legacy devices? Yeah, I don't think that's what Compose will be able to do, right? Like server-driven UI is still going to rely on the Vue.java as the base class, right? Because it still needs the text view, it still needs all the base components.
Yeah, I'm just reading that question now. And size of code, so can it replace Vue class as base entirely? No, I think the answer to that is no. Yeah. If I understand it correctly, I think like the thing with the thing that Jetpack Compose has minimum support of, is it Lollipop? I think. Anyway,
Right.
I can't remember. But you could still class some of those legacy devices. But I think as long as a device is running Lollipop and your project's supporting the required things, like you can use Jetpack Compose, regardless. But yeah, I don't think that's specific to the server-driven UI stuff. I don't think that would be affected by that.
Right. And effectively for this to work, right, the Vue.java class would have to be somehow backward compatible across all the OSs in the OS itself, right, and not as part of like a UI server-driven UI, right? Because that has nothing to do. The server-driven UI is a layer above the Vue.java, right? The Vue.java is the base, which is responsible for actual rendering on the canvas, whereas the server-driven UI is just giving you components which needs to be rendered. It does not.
Yeah.
There is no way for you to pass like the implementation of the OS Vue.java class and try to replace it. Like,
yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think that's the thing. Like, the server's clueless about what device it's being run on, what OS, whatever. It's just returning the components that need to be displayed on that screen. So yeah, it doesn't affect that at all. Yeah.
Cool. Looks like that's all the questions that we had. Vedant, do you have any other questions before we finish?
No.
We are almost close to an hour.
Yeah. So I think we can close the stream now. Joe, thanks a lot for joining the stream.
All right. Thanks for having me.